After months of negotiations, the United States, Mexico, and Canada have agreed on an updated trade deal replacing the 25-year-old NAFTA. It's called the USMexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, and it addresses key issues such as labor practices, environmental protections, and digital trade. The U.S. House of Representatives is expected to vote on the deal this week, and if it passes, would be a major victory for the U.S. President Donald Trump. Negotiators are hoping the real victory will be for North American workers.
I think it's going to do the most for manufacturing in this region. It's going to do the most for farmers in this region. Its digital trade and e-commerce provisions are the gold standard.
It's an agreement that benefits the workers of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It's an agreement that also strengthens cooperation for development.
Not only does it preserve essential cross-border supply chains, but it significantly increases workers' rights and levels the playing field for workers across North America.
For more on the trade agreement, let's bring in our panel. Here in the studio is Arturo Sarukhan. He is the former Mexican ambassador to the U.S. and founder and president of Sarukhan and Associates. Also with us is Kerrigan. She's the president and CEO of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council. From Toronto, Stephen LeDrew is a lawyer and contributor to the National Post, and Eric Farnsworth is vice president at the Council of the Americas. Arturo, I suspect you suspected. The first question will go to you, and it is, there's this dust-up this weekend, Mexico and the United States. Mexico not crazy about some of the language in the legislation talking about 5 attachés, concerned that they might be inspectors. The deputy foreign minister from Mexico to North America had this to say.
But yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This is very categorical. This personnel will not be labor inspectors. We discussed, I tell you, between us, in private, confidential, I tell you, we discussed adding words, such as, and therefore will not visit the plant or something. But we concluded anything you add reduces the coverage of the negative. They will not be labor inspectors.
Pretty animated about this. Talk to me about why Mexico was so alarmed.
Well, first of all, because this has always been a very asymmetrical relationship between Mexico and the United States. So anything that smacks of unilateral inspections, and remember, there was a proposal that Senators Sherrod Brown had presented that would have sent unilateral certification inspectors to inspect labor facilities in Mexico. And Mexico, from the get-go, said, this is unacceptable. So when this language in the implementing bill comes out, it's not very clear whether the Mexican government was ambushed or whether people were probably not looking at the fine print of what was going to go in the implementing bill. I, for one, argued that the Mexican Senate, that, by the way, approved the addendums on Thursday night, should have waited to see the implementing legislation on Friday to make, this happened with NAFTA, this has happened with free trade agreements with Colombia, with Peru, with Central America, with South Korea. The implementing bill always has additional language, which you've got to look for because there may be surprises. So I think that the letter that Ambassador Heiser sends Under Secretary Seade in response to his weekend tweets about, no, we won't accept inspectors, where Heiser says the labor attachés will not be doing enforcement and inspection, has sort of calmed the waters. Now, the big question is, what is the role of these labor attachés in Mexico? Remember, all embassies have attachés of different departments posted in the embassy. We have them, I had them here as an ambassador of every single department that has an agenda with the United States. So it's not really about whether you have 6, 1, 7, 10 labor attachés. It's what their role is going to be. And when you have panels for dispute resolution, which will be the real mechanisms for verification and enforcement, and you suddenly inject the idea of these attachés also doing monitoring and inspection, this is what created the kerfuffle. It would be easy to say that this was the proverbial much ado about nothing, and that at the end of the day, sort of things have seemed to return to their course. But, you know, there may be challenges as we go forward as to what the role and the profile of these labor attachés are once they hit the ground, once they're in the embassy in Mexico City, and once we start having a case of potential panel disputes that arise from questions regarding labor practices in Mexico. So at the end of the day, the big issue here is whether this is unilateral or whether it's symmetrical and reciprocal. And that's what I think created a lot of this over the past 48 hours in Mexico City.
Just to follow up, you brought up Sherrod Brown. He's a senator from Ohio. This is the Rust Belt. A lot of manufacturing jobs left. We're not saying that they all went away because of NAFTA, but some people contend that they have. Labor standards, a major concern on the part of these folks. How might that be addressed by Mexico?
Well, I think the labor reform that was approved by this Mexican administration, the López Obrador government, is a keystone reform. If you look at what's in the books now, in terms of Mexico's labor legislation, to what we had a year ago, there's a huge change. Now, again, the challenge, as in most things, is how do you ensure that that legislation is being properly enforced and applied? And so I think the concerns of many Democrats, valid concerns, are how do we ensure that that legislation has teeth, that we can ensure that it is being enforced, and that we don't have some of the same challenges that we've had with Mexico in previous decades when it comes to labor disputes and labor violations.
And you know, we were talking about Mexico, grousing about this. Karen, you know, it's interesting. Most of the time when you see a labor agreement like this, a deal like this, a trade deal, you see Republicans clamoring, saying this is fantastic. But because of the fact that the AFL-CIO, the head of the AFL-CIO was there with Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, when she addressed we're all in, all of a sudden you see people like John Cornyn, Pat Toomey, John Thune, all saying, wait a minute, talk to me about business and how some of the Republicans feel like in some respects they were blindsided as well.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously some of the Republican senators, you know, they wanted to be consulted. They wanted to be part of the process, right? I mean, it's, they saw one house, you know, one leader, one party, you know, involved with these negotiations, and I do feel like they wanted to have their input. So, and not only on the labor issue, but also on the IP issue as well, and the biologic issue. I think they were very, and continue to be very concerned about that as well. I don't know how many Republicans you're going to lose in the Senate on those issues, but I just think at this point they're sort of voicing concerns. They don't want to be left out. But I think at the end of the day, many of them are still saying, look, on balance, this is still a really, really important agreement, not only for certainty and stability for all of our businesses, but also the modernization pieces, a lot of the intellectual property protections, and that it's still important to do. So it's not going to be anything where they're going to be pulling back and say, we're not going to be supporting this agreement. Maybe, I don't know, we'll have to see where Mr. Toomey is, I guess, tomorrow, because he's doing a big speech at a big think tank on this very issue. But I think it's just a matter of being engaged and involved and wanting input into the process. If they're going to be the ones that are going to be voting, you know, on the agreement, then you know, no member of the Senate likes to be blindsided, right? So anyway, but at the end of the day, it's going to get big support over on the Senate side.
And Stephen, we haven't even touched on Canada. Trudeau has his issues as well, doesn't he?
Well, he does have the issues, but I think most Canadians and most parliamentarians in Canada are just glad that it's done. I think they're all grateful for the 2020 presidential election, because in the last campaign, Mr. Trump was shooting at Canada all the time, saying that we had sucked off all these jobs out of, as you mentioned with Ohio, the Rust Belt, which we can discuss another time if you want. But it really is the certainty of it. And so Canadians are very glad that because of the election coming up, many are saying that Mr. Trump had to have an agreement on this USMCA, that there had to be some certainty. And with the uncertainty that we've lived with for the last 2 years, with people saying, can we invest? Are we going to be producing things to be exported to Mexico and to Canada and vice versa? There was a bit of a stall. So a lot of parliamentarians are saying, yeah, we have some minor issues with it. There are some issues with the dairy industry that Trudeau took care of, issues with aluminum. But overall, Canadians are quite happy with it and just want to get it done, because the certainty will bring jobs. And yes, there are issues with, you know, digital protection and intellectual property. But overall, the main thing is, especially in election times, jobs, jobs, jobs. And with the certainty of an election, of this agreement, that is a lot better now than it has been in the last 3 years, and we don't want to be a target in this presidential campaign coming up.
I think there's a lot of people lining up in that category. Eric, you were saying to me before we actually went on the air that this is kind of a sea change in many respects.
You know, I think it really is, and the whole idea of certainty is key. But this negotiation has in some ways been a disruptor of certainty. I mean, the NAFTA was the ground that the business community and all three governments had been playing on for a generation. And to now have a renegotiation that has thrown some of the basic assumptions about trade into question and have to be rediscussed, renegotiated, relitigated, that has in itself, I think, caused a lot of people to sit up and take notice and say, well, wait a minute, at least from the U.S. perspective, the politics around trade have shifted, and therefore, in order to conclude an agreement, an update, an upgrade of a pre-existing agreement, we have to look at some things differently. And I think that's where we've seen some of the changes come. So, for example, we were talking about the Republican approach versus the Democratic approach. I think, yes, President Trump and the administration can claim that this is a major victory for them, but I also think that the Democrats in the House of Representatives can claim that this is a huge victory for Democrats, because they have brought the negotiation almost 100% over to what the Democratic position has been for a generation in terms of labor, and not just labor provisions, but as Arturo was talking about, labor enforcement, which has been the Achilles heel forever in terms of U.S. trade policy and trade negotiations, and also in terms of environmental issues, and also in terms of some of the way that wage rates are now being incorporated into actual trade agreements and various other things we can talk about. But the point is that the politics have shifted, and I think that has been baked into the agreement, which now becomes the new baseline for U.S. trade. And so as the U.S. goes forward now to renegotiate other trade agreements or to negotiate new trade agreements or what have you, this is going to be the baseline, the point of departure now going forward. And I think that is a real sea change.
And you were saying trade restrictions in many respects.
Well, in some ways. I mean, look,
managed
trade.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think in the auto sector, clearly we have it's been changed from what it used to be. Again, the politics may have required this sort of approach. And so I'm not smart enough to figure that out, but I do, it is clear that the approach has shifted, and autos, I think, is one very clear place of where that's been the case.
And you say a setback. In what ways?
Well, because whereas I think it's a bit of a glass half full, glass half empty. I think the fact that we've modernized the USMCA. Remember when NAFTA was negotiated 25 years ago, eBay and Amazon didn't exist. So the fact that we now have chapters and disciplines on e-commerce and digital flows and IP, that is extremely important. There clearly USMCA is a glass half full. But when you look at what we've done, what we've come up with as a result of these negotiations on the automotive and auto parts, we've gone back to a system which looks a lot like managed trade. By increasing rules of origin and North American content, what we're really doing is preventing the North American automotive industry, which is completely integrated in Canada, Mexico, and the United States, from competing where auto sales are going up through the roof. Auto sales are not increasing in North America. They've been on a flat line for the past decade and a half. Where they are increasing is in Asia. And with these new rules of origin for the automotive sector with the new USMCA, you're making it much harder for the automotive industry to compete where we need to be competing, which is in Asia, with all these new thresholds for rules of regulation. So that is, from my point of view, where I think the USMCA comes up short and is clearly a glass half full.
Karen, U.S. businesses, the one thing they always say, shed the regulations, shed the regulations. So are they going to embrace this?
Well, I mean, they are. I mean, you just got a letter that went up to the Hill with 600 business organizations saying pass USMCA. But you're right. I mean, there is heartburn, in some of these pieces, in some of these areas, and for the business community. And trade agreements are all about bringing down barriers, right? Lowering barriers to trade, lowering costs, opening markets, getting rid of tariffs, not regulating, or saying, oh, this is how, an industry needs to be regulated, or this is the rules of the road that we need to be setting for a particular industry. So I think that's sort of where there is some heartburn. And actually, I was up on the Hill at a USMCA meeting before coming here, and there was a discussion, well, is this really a template, moving forward, for other trade agreements? They would say, well, half of it, perhaps yes, in terms of IP, digital trade. There's a small business chapter in there, which we think is really a dynamic for entrepreneurs and small businesses, because most of our businesses in the U.S. that actually trade are small to mid-sized businesses. So lowering barriers, and we live in a platform-based economy, so we want to take advantage of these technology platforms. That's what makes it easier to do business. Yeah, so there's the heartburn, and it's like, well, so now we're going to go to the next agreement, and let's see what happens with that, whether it's going to be UK or where we're going to go. But I think this is an issue with the business community. It's all about lowering barriers, or is it lowering barriers, but then certain industries may have rules that, and I think there's concern about creep, right? Mission creep,
sure,
and
sure.
creep moving into other industries, and who's next, perhaps in the next trade agreement.
Stephen, are you hearing a lot of that in Canada as well, this managed trade concept and not being fully embraced?
Well, no, because they would rather have heartburn than a heart attack. And there's nothing like a barrier going along the 49th parallel, or the Mexican-American border, that's going to cause problems. I mean, we have streetcars in the city of Toronto, where I am right now, which are, the parts are manufactured in Mexico. They're shipped up through the States to Canada and put together here in Canada. So there is a lot of integration. And if we had not had this agreement, if we did not have NAFTA 25 years ago and this one, and I'm sure it's going to be ratified in the American government, and certainly in Canadian Parliament, then we have a real serious problem. And so there are some quibbles, and most people are saying, we can sort this out. Let's just see how it goes. Let's just see how we implement it and work it out with letters or with practice afterwards. And of course now, and it was just mentioned by the panel, maybe Britain. I mean, we have Boris in power in Britain with majority. So Canadians are looking at that saying, well, we not only have the EU, but we're going to be looking at having an agreement with Britain. And I understand that your president in the United States will be also looking very closely at expediting a very, very quick agreement with Britain. So I agree with the majority of the panel that this is a template, and it's good that it embraces trade. In other words, that's why people are so relieved about it, I think, because it says, okay, we're going to trade, as opposed to throwing up these barriers. That would be the heart attack. So we only have a little bit of heartburn, and let's move on and get this going around the world.
Let's move on. Eric, the House of Representatives believes that. They may vote on this as early as Thursday. However, you have a Senate impeachment trial that could slow things down in the Senate. Is the delay just a minor obstacle? I mean, how do you see that playing into all of this?
Well, this is fundamentally unpredictable in terms of how it goes forward. We all have our scenarios that we anticipate could occur, but I think the higher priority here is clearly the whole impeachment effort, and so we'll have to see how that resolves itself in the U.S. Senate. If it goes according to the way most people anticipate that it will, which will be quickly disposed of with an acquittal of the president, then indeed the Senate will be able to take up in relatively short order the USMCA and other activities that they might be required to do as well.
Karen, there's all this legislation, treaties, all this sort of stuff. It's very dense, lots of stuff to go through. It seems like, as you were saying, people don't actually read the documents until all of a sudden they're blindsided. Does the delay with the Senate trial give people more time to kind of parse things and start complaining more? I mean, do you see it as any kind of setback?
No, I don't. I mean, I think it's going to happen. It has the momentum. I sensed the momentum a month ago, that something was going to happen, and it is going to happen. And it will probably be, as was mentioned, a quick trial. So I think and let me just say for the record, absolutely, the U.S. business community is go-go on this treaty. And you're right, they would rather have a little bit of heartburn and have this certainty and move forward, because it is impacting and restraining investment, not only USMCA and where we're going here, but some of our other agreements. Obviously, China, has been a big heartache as well. But no, I think it's going to move forward, and if there is some little technical correction to be made, it will be made. But no, this is going to happen, and I think it will happen quickly.
Arturo, let me ask you about the relationship between the United States and Mexico, because all of this was going on, Mexico and Canada, and then finally it looked like there's an agreement, and then Trump threatens additional tariffs on Mexico because of the immigration issue. Where's the relationship now?
Look, it's certainly not at its peachiest moment in recent history. I think it has been a tense couple of years since President Trump, then candidate Trump, walked down the escalators in Trump Tower in Manhattan and said what we all know he said about Mexicans in the United States. He has used Mexico as a political electoral piñata. He will very likely use Mexico as a political electoral piñata in 2020 on the issue of border security, the wall, immigration. It feeds his base, it mobilizes his base. I see no reason why the president would stop doing this on the road to 2020. So that will continue to create some turbulence in the relationship. And I'm personally concerned that because of the way Mexico responded to the threat of punitive tariffs in March linked to immigration issues, that President Trump may have found a way to extract concessions on any other issues, whether it's drug trafficking or border infrastructure or water on the border. He's now found a way where he thinks, I believe, that he can make Mexico blink. And so that may factor in the coming weeks and months as the U.S. moves into full campaign mode in 2020. So we'll have to be on the lookout. Certainly, this has been a very, very complex moment in U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationships. You don't have to be Kissinger or a Nobel laureate to figure out why Mexico, of all the countries in the face of the earth, is where positive perceptions of the United States have fallen the most. Yeah. We went from 68% positive, favorable perceptions of the United States at the end of the Obama administration to 31% favorable perceptions of the United States right now. And part of that, most of that, is the Trump effect on the bilateral relationship. So that's going to be a challenge.
And looking to the north, the United States and Canada, there's been some issues, of course, with the dairy market and U.S. farmers. How was that resolved in this, and how are Canadians looking at that? Stephen?
Well, Mike, that was resolved because there is greater access to the Canadian market for American dairy products. And many Canadians are saying, well, that's great, that's competition. And as a result of the fact that we had an election last October, and this was coming up, and there was talk about it and conversations about it, the federal government has taken care of those dairy farmers who could run into problems as a result of this increased competition. It's called, that great old Canadian thing, subsidies. But when your friend there was talking about the relationship between Mexico and the United States, I mean, it pales in comparison to what our Prime Minister said about your president in London 2 weeks ago behind his back. And I mean, people are still shaking their heads, Mike. I mean, your president was justifiably upset and embarrassed, and I understand he left early and said, I'm out of here. I don't need to have this kind of stuff. And our Prime Minister was very chastised in the Canadian press and Canadian Parliament by everybody for this silly, immature move. But I understand now that, notwithstanding that your president was justifiably cheesed off at our Prime Minister, that our governments and our people have a very strong relationship. We have not had the divisive issues between Canada and the United States as the United States and Mexico has had. We're lucky that way because we have high labor costs, and we have all kinds of environmental rules as you do in the States, and it was not the cheap labor that was in Mexico. So overall, as I said, I don't want to be too sanguine about this. If we can just get our Prime Minister to just tone it down a little bit next time he sees the president. Again, we've taken care of the problems that may arise as a result of increased competition, as a result of this trade agreement. And we are, as I said, we're happy. And I understand our officials are working very hard to make sure that we don't have another blow-up again in London like we had 2 weeks ago.
Well, Robert Lighthizer saying this is going to benefit American workers, farmers, and ranchers for years to come. This is what he had to say on CBS's Face the Nation. Let's listen.
The president wants Mexico to enforce its labor laws. He doesn't want American manufacturing workers to have to compete with people who are operating in very difficult conditions. So there's.
But you don't think there's a political cost, because Republican senators were annoyed to be cut out of this last week.
There are always process issues. This bill is better now, with the exception of biologics, which is a big exception. With the exception of biologics, it's more enforceable, and it's better for American workers and American manufacturers and agricultural workers than it was before, for sure.
Eric, is it a much better deal, or is it pretty similar to the NAFTA we had?
Well, there's certainly some similarities. I mean, clearly NAFTA was the baseline, and you add on some TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation that Mexico and Canada were also a part of, and then you layer on some specific...
which we're still a part of.
Which are still, well, exactly right. You still are. The U.S. hasn't quite seen fit to do that, but good clarification, Arturo. But then some specific issues like the dairy that we've just been talking about, and some of those, and you got to the USMCA. But I think the bigger picture here has to be reiterated, and that is it's absolutely a win because it maintains at some level, at a high level, the North American trading and economic relationship. And that is fundamental to the well-being of U.S. workers and ranchers and farmers and all the folks that Ambassador Heiser was talking about. And it's that certainty that drives investment. And one of the things we've seen over the last year or 2 years of negotiation was that investors were actually keeping their investments and not deploying their capital, particularly to Mexico, because they didn't know what the rules of the game would be. So as Mexico's looking to restore growth, as President López Obrador is looking to recapture or rekindle some of the growth profile for Mexico, he needs that victory. So it's also good for Mexican workers and Mexican businesses because you're going to unlock now some of that capital that's been held in reserve. I would imagine the same is absolutely true with Canada as well. So yes, there are things about any negotiation, any trade agreement that don't satisfy certain sectors, and I think that's the nature of it. But if you compare this to a perfect agreement, whatever that perfect agreement might be, this probably falls some ways short. But if you compare it to no agreement or a collapse of the North American trade in an economic relationship, then it's a huge win for all three countries.
And we're going to leave it there. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And before we go, we want to invite you to check out our podcast. You can listen through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We cover similar stories from around the world. We get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.
Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find the Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search the Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.